The Vistula embankment was occupied by alarm units that had been pooled together at the nearest frontline control point. We had the presence of such a unit to thank for a last day of rest. The German inhabitants of the prosperous town had not all yet fled. They hoped that the enemy could be brought to a standstill at the riverbank. Despite the ample evening meal, everyone ate his fill of the plentiful supply of food. While the men were cooking chickens, I scoffed a full 10 scrambled eggs that Walter had rustled up for me by way of a change of diet. When the field kitchen arrived in the morning, most of the men made short work of another pot full of bacon and beans. The joker Franz said, tongue-in-cheek, that as far as he was concerned, the Führer could do away with the card system. After the meal, we stretched out to sleep. Someone had found a gramophone and got it working. Of the 2 records, only one was chosen. Adolf Hitler's speech, "Give me 4 years," was not requested. Instead, we had an old song, the melody of which I know to this day. It rang out from the tinny-sounding gramophone. Thus people love in Lisbon, in Tokyo, Vienna and Rome. The language of love is the same everywhere. On the afternoon of the 27th of January, we moved into the positions on the bank of the Vistula. My company's sector was the village of Jungensand, to the south of Deutsch Westfalen. On the snowy riverbank there were willows. Adjoining it was an embankment, some 5 meters high and sloping on both sides. To the east of the embankment ran the village street. On the other edge were clean, for the most part smallish farmsteads, all planted out with gardens. Since there were no trenches, we dug foxholes in the embankment. In the farm that I took as my command post, I met a lieutenant with a few troops on leave from many different units. As they got out of the train in Deutsch Köln, they had been gathered together into an alarm unit. The Herr Kamerad had let his men sleep in the outhouse while he had spent the night with mother and daughter in the farmer's bedroom. Grinning offensively, he suggested to me that I should do the same. Without saying anything, I looked at him, not understanding and full of contempt. Since the enemy obviously had need of a break, as we did, we were granted 2 days of rest. As our physical exhaustion abated, the oppression of our minds and spirits proportionately increased. The deserted dwellings, farms and settlements created a thoroughly sad atmosphere. There were columns of German refugees, old men, women and children with belongings they had had to snatch together as best they could in the emergency. We had already overtaken some of them on the way. Everything reinforced those sad impressions. The realization hit me that the area, German for more than half a millennium, would be irretrievably lost. In the stables there was still some warmth. Many farmers had not even been able to take all their stock with them. Gates and doors were standing open, as if the houses were still inhabited by their owners, and they had just gone out into the fields. The cellars and barns were full. The shelves of the dining rooms were stocked. In addition to the large amount of meat daily, we even had stewed fruit. We would have done without it, only we were still standing at Smolensk. We, the infantrymen, were to be the last to set foot over the threshold of those countless homes about to be given over to the enemy. Oh, Germany, poor fatherland, I thought at the time. I happened to find in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, verse 7, the text that essentially hit the nail on the head in describing what was happening to us. Even unto this present hour we both hunger and thirst, are naked and are buffeted, and have no certain dwelling place. Meanwhile, it had become known that we were in a pocket of huge proportions. The Russians in Pomerania had reached the sea, so we would see whether the troops, encircled and cut off, were still capable of breaking through to the west. This was what many hoped. Others feared that Danzig would be declared a Festung. As such, it would have to be defended, as usual, to the last drop of blood. The fighters wore grey, not brown, tunics. The pause for breath granted us by the enemy seemed to be ending. The Russians again began firing registration fire. Streets, embankment and houses were under not very heavy, but regular, fire from heavy weapons. As I was standing outside the door of the house, a Ratschbum shell hit the lintel. Apart from a tiny splinter that hit me in the mouth, nothing else happened. But it was puzzling where the shell had come from. The house was covered by the embankment in such a way that it could not be hit by direct fire. So the firing must be coming not from the bank immediately opposite, but from further up or down river. That, too, seemed to indicate that the Russians were up to something in our sector. In fact, during the night of the 29th of January, the enemy had crossed the Vistula in the sector of our neighbouring battalion in Deutsch Westfalen. They were then in the village with at least one company. Reserves, which could still have thrown them out again during the night, were of course not available. The division decided to take our battalion out of the line. Then, next day, it would be possible to carry out a local attack with the aim of driving the enemy back onto the right-hand bank of the Vistula. A meeting and the issue of orders took place in the regimental command post in the Schwenten forester's house. A crowd of senior people was present, as befitted the occasion. Vater Dorn outlined what he described as a shitty situation. That was to be expected from the conditions of the terrain. Since the plain in the glacial valley of the Vistula offered no cover, consideration had only been given to an attack from the north and south along the street, moving from house to house. 2 assault units were to work their way forward through the bushes on the bank on the far side, that is the enemy side, of the embankment directly on the riverbank. I was ordered to take command of the group advancing from the south. So this was the Himmerfahrt Commando, that evidently I was not to escape Himmelfahrt in German means ascension, in the sense of Christ's ascension into heaven. Its ironic use here is echoed by the term Himmelfahrtsstraße, Ascension Street, used in Auschwitz for the road leading to the gas chambers. I said jawohl and did not show any fear. As we were taking our leave, I thought that I could sense different looks and different handshakes from usual. I could feel that none of them wanted to be in my shoes, and were happy that the lot had not fallen to them. The esteem of the artillery commander, the visible respect of the Panzerjäger officer, and the fatherly kindness of Oberst Dorn made me inwardly happy. Then I was truly glad about Frymouth Husenet. In the meantime, he had relieved Klaus Nicolai as regimental adjutant. At 22, he was only 1 year older than I. He wore the Knight's Cross and the Goldene Nachkampfspange, was clean, modest, and cheerful. In his soft voice, in a heartfelt and brotherly way, he said, "Look after yourself." How seriously and importantly the operation was regarded by those higher up was indicated by the fact that the battalion was to spend the night in peace in Schloss Sartowitz. Sartowitz, some 5 kilometres behind the front line, was a trim manor house in the German Ostland. The great house was situated in a select spot high over the Vistula Valley, on what was once the bank of the glacial valley. The view from the terrace offered a tormentingly beautiful picture across the ice-covered river. There were little villages in the foreground, and out to the horizon was the town of Graudenz, embedded into the fortress above it. But because the great house could be observed by the enemy, and there had been instances of shells hitting the house, for the sake of peace and quiet we preferred the gentleman's residence. It was in a deeper location than the main house, and was covered by the trees of the park. In some of its 99 rooms we settled ourselves down. Before we all went to sleep, I gave precise instructions to the NCOs. Then I had to tell the men what awaited them the next day. However, I had to give them confidence. That had never been harder for me to do than it was then. I could not conceal from them the fact that there was only a slim prospect of our survival. But I said that they should nevertheless reflect that we were always, every one of us, in the hands of God. He would be with us every day, as always. Therefore, he would be with us tomorrow. Nothing would happen to us without his willing it, I said. God was with us, as it said on the belt buckles we wore next to our bodies. At 3 a.m., after I had lain for 4 hours in the deepest sleep, I was woken up. It was a battalion runner. Drowsy with sleep, I tripped over my boots. We had been permitted to allow ourselves the luxury of sleeping in the beds with our boots off. What was the matter? I asked Hauptmann Wild. He looked at me and said quietly, "Don't worry, it's been called off. We're going on with the retreat." The enemy had extended their bridgehead, and the village of Schwenten had been lost. Our battalion had to retake it. The first target of the attack was a 4-sided complex of farm buildings. It was a commanding position on a hill to the southwest of the village, surrounded by woodland 100 metres away from it. 2 assault guns were coming up to our support. With my company of only 20 men, I had to attack at a right angle to the other battalion. The assault guns remained with them. I had to push forward and draw the attention of the enemy onto me. The battalion with the assault guns would then advance. The enemy had seen the movement associated with our preparations, and let us know of it with fire from an anti-tank gun in the farmyard. The shells exploded on the trees over our heads, but the oaks and beeches were strong and gave us some protection. Our attack began after several salvos from our artillery and mortars. We came out of the protection of the woodland and immediately came under fire from the anti-tank guns. We went to ground, but the assault guns could be heard. There was consternation among the gun crew, who could be clearly seen in the corner of the farmyard. I leapt up and cried aloud. Once we were on the go, I did not need to give any more orders. The men were behind me. Walter overtook me because he wanted to be first in the position. The Russians, too, perhaps a platoon of them, were running away on the other side of the farm, and the anti-tank gun was standing there abandoned. We charged after them and into the farmyard. There were no longer any Russians. Only the gun, the limber, and 2 pathetic Russian horses remained behind. In the limber box, the men discovered what the Russians had plundered, namely a whole pile of pieces of German dairy butter. As I came out of the farm gate, I saw the battalion advancing with the 2 assault guns. I waved to the approaching platoon and turned round towards the enemy. Some of the men had already turned towards the valley in which the roadside village of Schwenten lay. Along the village street, fleeing in confusion, were a good 2 companies of Russians. They doubtless felt that they were threatened from the flank. "Off down in there!" I shouted, and once again the hurrah rang out from the few of us. The enemy, far superior in number, were running away. In the forester's house, in which a few days before Oberst Dorn had been based, and where the orders had been given for the counter-attack which had been called off, I set up my command post. It is true that we were in the cellar, whereas the Oberst had been on the ground floor. I looked at the room in which the meeting had taken place. A hole, 1 meter wide, was gaping in the wall. When it hit, it had caught the Oberst in the head and shoulder. In the cellar, a Russian command post had already been operating. Telephone equipment and half-empty American meat conserves with Cyrillic labels were lying about. And then the room was permeated by the almost indescribable smell of the Russian common soldier, which I can still smell today, but do not think I could begin to analyze. It could be a mixture of damp leather, horse shit, but also possibly the smell of the unwashed. The main line of resistance had been maintained for 2 or 3 days in front of Schwenten. After the departure of General Meltzer, the divisional commander was General-Lieutenant Dreckmann. At noon he visited my command post. In broad daylight he came driving up to the forester's house along the road, in full view of the enemy, with the red flashes on his overcoat. Outside the house he stopped. It was only with difficulty that he could be persuaded to come down into the cellar. At first I thought, because of the grand way in which he had arrived, that he was overexcited. But the reason for his behaviour soon became clear. He had obviously been knocking back too much cognac. His initial briskness soon passed over into joviality. Then he adopted a patronising and encouraging tone as far as the situation was concerned. When the opportunity presented itself, I mentioned that I was the regiment's last horse in the stable, namely the last Schützenkompanie commander to have survived from the 14th of January. That made no impression on him, and he soon drove off again. Walter shouted loudly after him the wish that a Ratschbum would get him. That would teach him the meaning of fear. But luckily for all of us, that did not happen. On the contrary, the same afternoon a similarly careless attitude had the result that little Hauptmann Hein was not so lucky. He had been called Freund Hein in 1943 by Oberst von Eisenhardt. Like many others, he had also been a friend to me. It was said that in the school of the neighbouring village, the divisional commander had held a large officers' meeting. The Russians must have noticed. They radioed to their firing position with the result that there were several dead and wounded, including Hauptmann Hein. The careless general, however, had remained uninjured. On the 7th of February, the Russians had pushed us out of the village. I had given up the command post in the forester's house and withdrawn 500 metres up the road to the Meyerhof. There, a man from the 14th Panzerabwehr Company had put paid to a Stalin tank with a Panzerschreck. The main line of resistance then ran along the front of a brick-red so-called Insthaus. At the rear were the entrances to the living quarters of the estate workers, the Instleut. I lived in the kitchen of that squalid dwelling. Facing the doors to those dwellings was a ramp a metre high, to which I owed my life. To get some air, I stepped through the door onto the ramp, leaving the door open. Every now and then a mortar shell exploded close by, but the ramp was in the blind corner of the building. It seemed to give cover against shell splinters that came from above, and also against the dangerous splinters from mortar shells that flew out horizontally. Then, suddenly, A shell exploded very close by. A blow on my chest flung me through the open door back into the room. The men leapt up and surrounded me, helped me up and asked if I was wounded. At first I did not know. Then I saw and could feel that my limbs were in one piece. I could move them, and I was not bleeding anywhere. What had happened? A shell splinter, just the size of a fingernail, had gone through my winter overcoat. It then bored through the 32-page map, which had been folded 16 times, stuck between my winter clothing and my field tunic. The paper of the map, folded many times, had so reduced the momentum of the shell splinter that it had been slowed down before it went through my field tunic. The shell, as it fell, had passed within 20 centimetres of me and the slope of the ramp. The ramp had caught all the shrapnel flying in my direction, apart from the one shell splinter that I pulled out of my coat. However, my intention to send home, as war mementos, the shell splinter and the map that saved my life was fruitless. At that time, the post was no longer functioning properly. The following night, I was ordered to lead an attack in order to move the main line of resistance forward a little. Nobody knew where the enemy was. A Russian Maxim machine gun was popping at us from the rising ground to the east of the forester's house. However, there was to be no preparatory barrage. We were to report and then to drive out the enemy with a shout of hurrah. It was a well-known fact that the Russians avoided fighting at night, but the high-ups had evidently forgotten that we too were no longer the heroes of the first years of the war. In spite of everything, we went forward. There was impenetrable darkness. Soon it took all our efforts to keep the leading man in sight. We were shadows and outlines creeping over the snow-covered terrain towards the chattering machine gun. Every one of the soldiers no doubt felt, as I did, the pounding of his own heart. After a while, the enemy machine guns ceased firing. We got as far as the forester's house, but it too had been abandoned. The enemy had evidently withdrawn of their own accord. We had by then reached the southern edge of the Tuchola Heath. With differing degrees of intensity, the enemy went about driving us out of the wooded terrain. By the 11th of February, we had spent 3 days and 3 nights in the woodland and in the snow. We had been without a roof over our heads and without sleep. On the first day, the Russians were still trying to advance into the woodland, but then had given up. I had not heard for quite some time the rattling and twittering of infantry weapons in the woodland. Sometimes, when a ricochet whistled into a certain corner of the woodland, it sounded just like singing. "The little birds in the wood, they sing so wonderfully," was the line that occurred to me, in romantic longing. But it was not at all romantic, just very serious, when one of the singing bullets slashed open the flapping leg of my winter trousers. In snowy hollows, we tried to snatch a quarter or half an hour of sleep. We did not manage to sleep for longer because, as time passed, the cold, 10 degrees below zero, penetrated our ragged uniforms. In my case, there was the added misery that my feet, which had otherwise been warm with walking, threatened to freeze to the soles of my boots. They had turned to ice. On the evening of the 12th of February, we crept into the Mishka forester's house. It was the only house for miles around. At night it was packed full of soldiers from various units. Following Hauptmann Wild's orders, I tried to get my people, insofar as they were not outside on sentry duty, together in one room alone. My attempt failed, so I had to go round trying to free up at least a few corners of rooms for us. It was important, because the forester's house was on the front line in our sector. At any moment, an enemy assault unit could attack. To be able to repulse it, the unit commander had to have his people together at all times, ready for combat at the shortest notice. That, however, was not guaranteed if the members of a large number of different units were lying about, mixed up in the numerous rooms. In the very first room I met resistance from a Feldwebel. The men around him, apparently his people, made room to a certain extent willingly, but he on the other hand remained lying down. I spoke to him sharply, and gave him as an officer the direct order to get up immediately, and to leave the room with his people. He remained unaffected. "I will give you 2 minutes. If you have not obeyed my order by then, I shall shoot you." I did not wait to see the effect of my words, but went to Hauptmann Wild to report the incident to him. Wild sat in the light of my tallow candle, not looking up, and said dryly, "Do what you want. Herr Hauptmann, I just can't simply shoot the man." I exclaimed, but Hauptmann Wild, the brave man, the fatherly comrade and the pastor, seemed to be at the end of his strength. He did not express an opinion, and he took no part in what was agitating me. He shifted onto my shoulders the responsibility for deciding and acting, and once again replied tonelessly and apathetically, "Do what you want." Irresolute and uncertain, I turned back, fearing that the chap would still be lying in his corner. That was in fact the case. I could no longer restrain myself. Stirred up to the highest degree, I shouted at him, "Get up immediately and leave this room, or I shall shoot you on the spot." Inwardly, I was trembling. I wondered whether the chap would obey this order. While my trembling fingers were reaching for my holster, another Feldwebel, one of his comrades, intervened to calm and to placate me. Even his words, that the man who was refusing to obey my orders was a tried and tested and excellent soldier, I turned against him, saying that in that case he should know all the better that he had to carry out my orders like any others. But even as I was saying this, and as the Feldwebel had pointed out to me, I felt that the behaviour of the man refusing to obey my order could not have any rational cause. He was completely exhausted, and at the end of his strength. What would have happened if I had shot the man? Nothing would have happened. As in earlier retreats and crisis situations, it had become the duty of senior officers to use weapons in cases of refusals to obey orders. They could shoot the offender immediately and without a court-martial. I was therefore formally, completely within my rights. The facts of the case clearly attested to a refusal to obey orders. Moreover, my commander had expressly given me a free hand. The order was, in fact, completely well-founded. But what were those men doing in our sector? Were they men who had been scattered, or were they deserters? To establish which it was, I was much too agitated and did not have the time. I had only time for the shot that would re-establish discipline and order. But I did not fire it. The man was almost as exhausted as I. Probably, just like me, he had not slept during the previous days and nights. He had most likely been overwhelmed by a physical, mental, and spiritual exhaustion that left him no longer in control of his actions. It would have been the same for me if I had not been an officer, if I had not had to be a leader, and if the enormous agitation about the inconceivability of this refusal to obey orders had not then overwhelmed me. A remnant of common sense within me restored my sense of proportion. I gained enough control over myself to be able to ponder whether the insignificance of the case was worth his death. Was it right that my order should be carried out by that man? So I came to the conclusion that I should not allow myself to be guilty of his death, even if I was in every respect justified in doing so, even if it was my duty to do so. I walked out into the dark of the February night. I was oppressed by the dichotomy of feelings of defeat that my formalistic spirit had suffered. But I was also glad of my victory over that spirit. For one trembling moment, I had held the life of that man in my hand and nearly destroyed it. Outside, the Feldwebel comrade of the mutineer joined me and said that I was a fine man. He seemed suddenly to trust me, because he had recognized me as a fellow countryman. Then, in all seriousness, he proposed that I should travel to Vienna with him. He had, he said, a motorcycle and sidecar. His unit had been wiped out and he had had enough. With me as an officer, he said, we would easily get through the Feldgendarmerie checkpoint and through the Heldenklaus. I was speechless. Should I now have this man arrested, taken away and shot? I shook my head, uncomprehendingly, without saying a word. He disappeared. The 15th of February is the date of my last letter to Mother that actually reached her, in which it says, "The past 4 weeks have made inhuman demands on us. We continue to be in the hardest action on a Soviet bridgehead southwest of Graudenz. Enormous physical exertions through snow, rain, cold, marches, all combined with the most intense moral stress, have almost completely done for us few, who are still left from the 14th of January. But the good God in heaven has been so clearly protecting me. In the meantime, I have been wounded for the 5th time, apart from that wound in 1943, which was only slight. Daily events have been a strain, the like of which did not even happen in the summer of 1944. It was in Doberitz that I last had my hair cut. Since the 14th of January, I have not cleaned my teeth. I have not had a shave for a long time. You will be able to imagine how attractive I look. But we want to keep on holding out, if it leads to everything being better in the end, and then it means that we can all meet again happily in our homeland. Hopefully Rudy will get out of East Prussia in one piece. On the way I met people from his ersatz unit from Ripon, including an officer cadet colleague from Hilversum. I am writing this letter in gloves. Yesterday, with the first post since New Year, I received a letter from Father and 2 from Rudy. Tell Liesel thanks very much for her good wishes on my birthday. On the 16th of February we were marching in a northerly direction towards Dubelno. Clouds of shrapnel had indicated that the enemy attack was going to continue. It was always the same. A couple of hours, perhaps a night, perhaps 2 days without pressure from the enemy. Then the Russians attacked again, pressing and pushing us back. Meanwhile, we had been driven on to the Tuchola Heath. For more than 4 weeks we had had no abiding city. Around noon I had a splinter from a mortar shell in my right upper arm. It came through the open window of a farmhouse in which we were resting. It was, of course, too small a wound for a military hospital. But for all that, the feeling of nerves that had gripped me since morning fell away from me. I then knew why. You could see that on the other side of the Vistula, a captive balloon was sitting enthroned in the sky, untouched. There were no German fighter aircraft in its vicinity. Our Luftwaffe had long since vanished into thin air. Only on the next morning did a German fighter aircraft attempt to approach the balloon, but it was driven away by hundreds of Russian flak and other guns. Meanwhile, the cold had broken. On the 17th of February, we were lying in fresh trenches in front of the Graudenz-Köniz railway line, on a tongue of land a kilometre wide, in the midst of woodland. It was a typical stretch of countryside for the Tuchola Heath. The Russians had pushed forward through the woods. To the north and to the south they had reached the railway line. Until then we had stood firm, but we were then shelled by a series of salvos from German Nebelwerfer that the enemy had captured. The enormous detonations of their heavy-caliber guns made the still, frozen earth shake. We pressed ourselves against the walls of our trenches and wished that the attack were over, so that such hellish music might come to an end. Despite the mortar fire, which had had a very demoralizing effect, the enemy only advanced hesitantly. It was easy to keep them at a distance with targeted rifle fire. Once again my Sturmgewehr, with its U-shaped back sight and the flat pin, was proving its worth. The next day, the railway line in our sector was given up. We withdrew over a bridge that had been prepared for blowing. It led over an artificial ravine. Nobody knew who was supposed to be blowing up the bridge, or when and from where it was to be done. So it was a matter of climbing down 25 metres into the ravine and clambering up again on the other side. Actually, I saved myself the trouble and ran across the bridge, feeling foolhardy. Certainly, once across, I became aware of how careless I had been. In the next village there was a short halt. The halt was rudely interrupted when out of a haystack a Russian machine pistol sprayed fire and 2 of our people fell, hit by the bullets. From a little distance away, I saw an Unteroffizier having a go with the Sturmgewehr, whereupon a Russian came crawling out. Evidently he was making a move to flee. The corporal fired once more, and the treacherous deed was atoned for. Some days later, Hauptmann Wild assigned me to his staff, if you could still call it that. But he doubtless wanted to do me a good turn, or to protect me a little, because in fact I was the last officer who was still there from the 14th of January. In any event, it did not matter to me. I simply moved about here and there on foot. Whether I commanded the 10 men of my company or supported the Hauptmann in commanding the 50 men of the battalion, there was no essential difference. We pulled back further. On a narrow country road that ran through the heath in the middle of splendid woodland, we were still about 20 kilometres south of Preußisch Stargard and 60 kilometres away from the Baltic at Danzig. On the 24th of February, Hauptmann Wild celebrated his 35th birthday. The kitchen Unteroffizier had not forgotten him. He brought a cake into the forester's house in which we were resting. It had been part-baked during the retreat, but he only produced it after he had fed us with roast pork, and no one could eat any more. Sitting in the deserted house, in a velvet-covered grandfather's chair belonging to the forester, I stretched my legs out onto the leather armchair opposite. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I was wakened by the explosion of an anti-personnel mine. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. An enemy patrol must have trodden on it. What the hell, I thought. The enemy never attacks in the dark at night. Besides, I could not care less. I wanted to sleep. You can all go hang. Drowsy with sleep, those were my thoughts. At the northern edge of the Tuchola Heath, a little beyond the wood, the battalion had moved into a wide sector. We could only hold on at key points. On the morning of the 26th of February, we had repulsed an enemy patrol. Since then, the enemy had not pushed on after us. They were obviously exhausted and needed a breather. They stayed in the wood, preparing for another assault. Because of that, we hoped that a few days' rest would be granted to us. Almost overnight, the snow had disappeared. The warm March sun had sucked it up, and a mild wind was blowing over the fields, all newly brown. In the open meadow, tiny shoots of green seemed to be sprouting. My imagination seized onto an illusion of reawakening life. Our winter clothing was handed back to the baggage train. The railway station at Gross Wallenthal was the battalion key point. It lay furthest to the left. It was occupied by the remnants of my first company. There were still 15 of them, commanded by a lieutenant who had just come from Germany. They had installed themselves in the railway buildings and had a good field of fire. Within the solid, thick walls, they felt themselves to be protected for the time being. It was the typical brick station of a smaller town, such as could be found in a good 1,000 stations in northern Germany. A little while before it had still been in operation, the air still smelled just like a railway station. The small farmhouse that housed the command post had thin walls. The only room was on the southern side, facing the enemy. Since we had already grown apathetic as a result of our exertions, comfort had won the day over the regulation efforts to provide security. Instead of taking up our quarters in the stable on the southern side of the house, we used the room facing the enemy. There were 2 beds. Men and officers slept in them, in shifts, of course, without being able to take off their boots or clothes. We had not been used to such peace for a long time. I could count on my fingers the days and nights that I had not slept without my boots. That continued during the war of movement, the trench warfare, or whenever else in that campaign. In my dreams I heard the hiss of a hand grenade and the nasty quiet fizzing of the fuse before it exploded. I was dreaming that an enemy assault unit was in the process of digging us out and had thrown a hand grenade into the room. Still half asleep, I jumped out of bed, and the laughter of my comrades brought me fully awake. But there was an element of truth in the dream. An infantry gun shell had come through the wall over my head and the headboard of the bed. It had stuck into the opposite wall of the room. Mortar was still crumbling down from the wall. On the 4th of March 1945 at 8:05 a.m., a forward observer reported heavy enemy movements from Gross Wallenthal moving northwards. At 8:15 a.m., accompanied by intense aircraft activity, there began a heavy enemy preparatory barrage, particularly on the sector of our left-hand neighbour, Grenadier Regiment 7. Following that, the enemy, supported by strong armoured forces, attacked from the direction of Gross Wallenthal and Neubuchen towards the railway line. That was how the regimental history described the start of the day. As I recall, the neighbouring sector on the left was under heavy fire. The commanding high ground to the north of Gross Wallenthal lay behind us to the left and fell into enemy hands. The battalion, that is, our 15 men, received orders to retake the high ground. First, we had to pull back a little to strike. Then we moved up to where the artillery positions were, in order to be able to move in a semicircle round the high ground that had been lost. In the meantime, the enemy were giving the terrain a vigorous pounding with heavy weapons. In particular, they fired on the farmhouses that lay on their own. They rightly suspected firing positions to be there. They had also spotted our movement while we were approaching the open heights. At the last farm at the foot of the heights, there were field howitzers under trees that were firing on them. From the enemy positions came the thumping of the mortars. All round we could hear shells whistling towards us and exploding. From early morning I had felt, in my water, a sense of apprehension. So I was almost relieved when what I had dreaded actually happened. I had thrown myself to the ground, but I jumped up too soon in order to move towards the house, thinking there might be better cover there. I must obviously not have heard the mortars fire because of the sound of the explosions. The severe pain of a considerable flesh wound in my left buttock forced me to the ground. I painfully crawled towards the house. I felt a lack of air that worried me. I knew I must have been shot through the lungs. One of my runners dragged me into the house where I was laid down on a bundle of straw. A medic from the artillery bandaged me up. I was taking shallow breaths, gasping and struggling for air. The best chance of getting to the rear and to a dressing station was to go on the artillery food vehicle. It had just arrived at the firing position. It was to take me with it, but it took another quarter of an hour that seemed like an eternity, until it was ready. Then I was lifted up onto the little wagon. The loading area was too small to lie down, so I had to sit up with the driver. But I hung rather than sat on the driver's seat, at the same time clinging onto the driver and to an iron armrest. A wild drive began. Enemy aircraft flew over us. The driver could not risk using roads and lanes. The horse was galloping in terror. The wagon bumped and tossed across country over meadows and fields, furrows and trenches. It was sheer torture. At the staff of another unit, the driver unloaded me. A doctor gave me a tetanus injection. Sometime later, I was loaded up into a sanka, that is a medical vehicle. After an absolutely endless journey, I arrived at the field hospital section of the 35th Division, our neighbouring division. There, in a small village school, the wounded as they arrived were laid on bundles of straw. A medical officer sorted us out according to urgency, not according to rank. All men are equal before God and before the court, but also before the surgeon's knife. Of the two schoolrooms, one served as an operating room, the other as a preparation room. In the latter I was undressed, and by means of injections somehow stabilized. Scarcely had the surgeon finished with one man than he got to work on me. Half on my belly and half on my right side, I lay on the operating table. It was only a local anaesthetic under which the operation was carried out. The doctors asked me questions and forced me to answer them. Meanwhile, I could hear my breath bubbling out of the entrance wound and could feel them working to close it. How long that lasted, I have no idea. According to what they said, they were doing plastic surgery on my skin. The effect of the anaesthetic had already begun to wear off by the time the larger shell splinter from my behind and another lodged immediately next to my spine were taken out. The staff medical officer, Dr. Brunn, asked whether I wanted to throw the shell splinters away. I replied, "Too bloody true. The scars would be mementos enough for me. The shell splinter in my lungs I would carry for the rest of my life." After the operation, I was moved into a small room. In one of the two beds was the man wounded in the stomach, who had been operated on before me. I was able to have a closer look at him and to recognize him. He was the commander of the reconnaissance battalion of the 35th Infantry Division. He was a major and a holder of the Knight's Cross. From time to time we spoke to each other, but I had the strange thought almost immediately that there was little hope for him. Even so, they also seemed to consider me to be a serious case. The major and I were nursed by a particularly capable Obergefreiter medic. On his tunic was the Kriegsverdienstkreuz First Class, which testified to his quality. Every quarter of an hour, I estimated, he came back into the room and administered injections in my upper thigh. During the 2 days I spent there, I must have had, I estimated, getting on for 80 injections. For years afterwards, the area in which they had been administered above my knees was numb. The following night, the major reached the end of the road. He was increasingly struggling for air. It seemed to me that he had a heart attack. The medic came with Dr. Brunn, and they brought an oxygen machine, but could not help the poor man. I was then alone. But I was myself too weak to be significantly affected by the death struggle of my comrade. The following day, the medic told me that the previous night an armoured breakthrough had been made. The enemy tanks, he said, had come very close, and they had feared that they would have to let us fall into Russian hands. On the 8th of March, after 4 days, I was at last transported away. A medical motor vehicle drove me and other wounded men to a station. It must have been the one at Preußisch Stargard, where we were put in cattle trucks and laid down on straw. During the loading process, some wretch of a medic stole my pistol. That filled me with the overpowering fury of the helpless. I was glad that immediately after I had been wounded, I had, at his suggestion, handed over my watch to my runner Franz. In Danzig, Sankas took us to the technical high school in Langfjord. It had been set up as a military hospital. At first, I lay with about 50 other seriously wounded men in a large hall. I was in a pitiful state because I was getting no air. After a short examination, I was immediately taken by porters into the operating room. The porters were French prisoners of war obediently doing what was expected of them. From the map case, which had not been stolen from me, I brought out my remaining cigarettes, that I certainly no longer needed. Gratefully, I gave them to the Frenchman. The operating room resembled a gigantic human abattoir. A haze of vapours of blood, pus, sweat and filth from the dressings and disinfectants filled the room. On several tables, operations, amputations and dressings were performed. A doctor had just finished the circular cut around an arm, then began an upper arm amputation. All that I saw, though only half conscious, acting as theatre nurses, were Dutch medical students. Doubtless they were compulsory labour, and were getting some dreadful practical experience. I had to place my arm round the neck of one of these kindly and helpful nurses. Dizzy and weak, no longer used to sitting upright, I had my lungs tapped. An increasing lack of air and the unbearable smell had made me so apathetic that I scarcely noticed the short, severe pain when the doctor inserted the cannula. The intervention produced an aspiration of 700 cubic centimetres. It was no wonder that I had feared I was slowly suffocating. I was then able to breathe again during the following 2 weeks. The next aspiration produced another half-litre of fluid. After that, there were only 20 cubic centimetres. Eventually, the interventions were no longer necessary. By then, the hospital needed the room. So after about 10 days, there was a great visitation headed by a general of the medical service. They sorted the wounded and had to empty some beds. In his numerous entourage, there was one corpulent medic. He could have been a factory manager. He had doubtless only recently been caught by the Heldenklau and had gone to ground in the medical service. When the swarm of doctors had passed my emergency bed, I asked that medic to hand me the inflatable pillow from the foot of the bed. He replied that I should ask someone else because he was not responsible for doing that. I could scarcely believe my ears and lost my temper. There I was, lying pale and hollow-cheeked, hair on end from lying down, and uncut for 4 months, unshaven and generally run to seed, and obviously seriously wounded on a wooden bedstead. On the seat next to it was my field tunic with all its medals, including the silver wound insignia. In front of me was that fat man, with prosperity written all over him. He was all dressed up, his hair slicked down, and he had the nerve to say that he was not responsible for carrying out one small service consisting of handing over one small thing. Never before during my service as an officer had I lost control of myself before a subordinate, yelled at him and pulled rank on him, as I had with this man. With the last remnants of strength and breath remaining in my wretched body, bellowing, I unleashed the full fury of the front-line fighter against the damned people behind the lines. We are letting ourselves get shot to pieces out there on the front line, and this swine, who has never heard the whistle of a bullet in his life, is not responsible for handing an inflatable pillow to a seriously wounded man. I was going mad. Tears were choking my words. I was no longer in control of myself. Some gentlemen from the visitation at first were shocked and indignant. Then some staff came over to calm me down, while the travesty of a Samaritan hurriedly left the room. Even more than the days, the nights in that room were full of dread. Every evening I was given morphia, but its numbing effect only lasted for a few hours. By 1 o'clock in the morning, I would wake up in the stained bed and wait patiently for an unwilling nurse, who would get peevish having to clean things up. I had never experienced such an accumulation of misery as I had in that room. A boy near to me asked again and again for water. Shot in the stomach, he had recently been operated on and was not allowed to drink. Everybody tried to make him understand that, but failed. One moment when he was not being watched, he opened his hot water bottle. I was too weak to be able to warn him as he greedily gulped down the contents. The following morning he was dead. Opposite me, another man had had both his legs shattered. Resigned and quiet, he lay on his bunk. That was the way he died. On the other hand, those impressions, however depressing they were, gave me courage, and I used them to pull myself together. I had no intention of dying. The hope of getting out was germinating in me. Certainly the town was encircled, and certainly I was not fit to be moved. In fact, for days I had had a high fever, but that would pass, I hoped, and by ship or by aircraft I surely must be able to get away. I felt a hesitant joy at the fact that evidently I had got away with it again. With the greatest difficulty I managed to scribble some lines to Mother and to Gisela. Gisela received them, but Mother did not. From there they carried me to a room on the second story of the building. 6 wooden bunks filled the room. My new comrades, all officers, were seriously wounded like me, but obviously over the hill. My right-hand neighbour was Franz Mannhardt, flak lieutenant from Grafenberg near Eggenberg in Lower Austria. He had managed to reach the level of section head in the finance ministry in Vienna. His left upper arm had been shattered, but he could hobble. Opposite was the anti-tank Oberleutnant Nabert from Schweitnitz, whose left arm had been amputated. As it turned out, we had a whole series of common acquaintances in Schweitnitz, including an actress from the Landestheater whom I had seen in Sudermann's Frau Sorge. When his dressings were being changed, Nabert's stump gave out such a stench that we regularly felt sick. On the left, next to me, lay a Panzerhauptmann, whose right upper thigh had been shattered. He tried in vain to move the toes on his foot. Then he was taken to be operated on, and came back without his right leg. After waking up from the anaesthetic, he felt with both hands to where his knee had been. He could still feel it. The realization that he was an amputee hit him like a bolt of lightning. Gasping, he drew the air through his teeth. Then, without making a sound, he put his hands over his face in horror. On the evening of the 25th of March, he was taken away by members of his unit. A destroyer had intended to make a run for it during the night, and was to take him along. As I found out after the war from Herr von Gahn, our division also sent a detachment to remove wounded men from the hospital. Obviously the group could not have carried out the order properly, because they did not find me. No doubt they had only been on the ground floor. It is idle to speculate whether I might have been lucky and subsequently reached Denmark with the regiment on board a ship. The front line was approaching. The large pocket had shrunk to a beleaguered town and declared a Festung. An old reserve officer, an invalid from the First World War, and teacher by profession, went from room to room. He tried, as a National Socialist officer leader, to spread confidence in victory. Nobody took him seriously anymore, but I still hoped that I might be transported away. Exactly 3 weeks after I had been wounded, my high fever fell overnight to normal. The crisis had passed. The euphoria of the convalescent came over me. The doctor declared me to be capable of being moved, but by then it was too late. The harbour was blockaded. 2 days before, it was said, one last hospital ship had sailed out. But it had been torpedoed and had sunk with hundreds of wounded men on board. In actual fact, it was the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was sunk by a Russian submarine. There were several thousand refugees on board. 2 days previously, when I was unable to be moved, I had struggled against my fate. Once again I had to learn my lesson and resign myself to the inevitable. An elderly lieutenant from the supplies services had been laid in the Hauptmann's bed. He was very drunk and had obviously been injured by a bomb splinter while in that state. Soon afterwards he died, still in the state of intoxication in which no doubt he had spent the last days and hours of his life. When he was taken out, I asked for his pistol. I still had the thought of making use of it. In the meantime, Russian and British aircraft were bombing the town. Bombs fell day and night. Heavy artillery shells landed. In the park of the high school, artillery and flak went into position. The explosions of the impacts very close by, and the sharp cracks of our own guns and cannons as they fired went on alternately. The front was right there. We lay helpless, stuck in bed, on the topmost floor of the building. On the doctor's rounds, we asked if it was possible for us to be placed in the cellar. The station medical officer replied with the words, "You're surely not just a bit afraid, gentlemen." Saying that, he smiled, but at the same time remained for safety's sake under the cover of the lintel of the door. He evidently considered us to be some of those guilty for the war. He perhaps believed that we should face our just punishment in the form of a bomb. He was not allowed to gainsay it, for instance, by taking us down into the cellar. Even the ward medic no longer very often summoned up the courage to climb from the cellar to the upper ward. When it was absolutely necessary, he brought up food. While butter and other provisions were supposedly stored in great quantities in food depots, they dished out only thin carrot soup to us. Sometimes there were a few slices of bread spread with cheese and marmalade. Right in front of our eyes, however, the medic would still be biting pieces off a block of chocolate. When taken to task about it, he declared shamelessly that none had been issued for the wounded. All those symptoms indicated the end to be imminent. It was a collapse that was taking place around and within us. Had we deserved that fate? Should they leave us there to kick the bucket like miserable dogs? Should they leave us to the tender mercies of the Bolsheviks? Bitterness and disappointment came over me, and doubtless also over my comrades. There was silence in the room. Nobody spoke. Everyone, lying there so wretchedly on the floor, was alone at a turning point in his life. On the 27th of March 1945, the Tuesday before Easter, a bright spring morning dawned. Neither doctor nor medic appeared. The enemy artillery fire had become more and more intense. A direct hit on the wall of the building sent window frames and panes flying crackling into the room. Then rifle fire could be heard. Thus it was finally clear that no one else was to get out. We would be consigned to an uncertain fate. But why, I thought, should they not leave me alone there? Who was I to be able to claim that the course of my life should be only smooth and good? I realized that I had considered myself to be too important. I realized that I had been just a tiny interchangeable part in the massive German war machinery. But by then it was obviously grinding to a halt. I reached once again for the pistol. I took hold of it, but put it down again. The thought of suicide was at first as strong and serious as it had been that time in Pawilin. But by then it was done with. Suddenly I knew that an important part of my life was certainly coming to an end, with us losing the war. However, life, even if perhaps under completely different circumstances, would go on. It would still be worth continuing to live, but not to give in to oneself. A wonderful clarity came over me. Praying, I experienced the certainty that God would not leave me in the lurch, and that he would be with us, with me. I thought long and hard about my mother. Lost in all those thoughts, I detached myself more and more, finally completely from the situation. Then another medic appeared. He had orders to collect up pistols and medals. He announced that the hospital had been surrendered to the Russians. He said that 2 doctors and 10 medics had remained behind with 800 severely wounded men. The white flag, he said, had already been raised. Another hour passed. Franz Machnart stood at the window and reported back on the situation. He saw our infantry retreating and the Russians moving closer and closer. Meanwhile, again and again, there were moments of anxious quiet. Finally, voices could be heard, announcing an approach from room to room. Andreev shouted out several times. They were the same dull, throaty sounds that I had heard for the first time 3 years before in the woods at Upolossi. The voices had exactly the same effect on me as they had then. Both wings of the door were opened as the first Russian entered. His machine pistol at the ready, he stood at the doors and looked around. Meanwhile, outside, next to the house, German shells were still falling.